You're listening to Podcasts with Park Rangers, a show where we bring to you stories of the national parks and historic sites from those who know them best, park rangers. Get to know each park ranger for their love of the parks as we discuss history, science, and the beauty of nature from a unique perspective. I'm your host, Lucas VK. Today we interview Wendy Gordge, the Chief Interpretive Ranger at El Morro National Monument, a hidden gem of the national park system located just west of Albuquerque.
I think it's rather unusual to find a national monument to have over 1,000 years of history and so many interesting and fascinating stories of the various people that came through here. Some well-known and some just what we would think of as everyday folk, but yet with amazing stories.
We'll discover unique stories of inscriptions on a rock face and discuss camels in the desert of New Mexico. A village is built atop a sandstone bluff as a man carves hand and toe steps in the cliff face. His people will need to climb 200 feet down the sheer cliff face to get water. The pool at the bottom of this bluff serves as the only reliable water source for 30 miles, making it a good place to call home. Over time, pictures are drawn on the rock face. Bighorn sheep, grizzly bear paws, footprints, a human face. Ancestral Puebloans drew hundreds of petroglyphs on the side of what we now call El Morro National Monument. However, these aren't the only markings left by man on a bluff in the middle of a desert. About 300 years after the petroglyphs appeared, thirsty Spanish conquistadors leave their mark as they drink from the same pool of water as the ancestral Puebloans. Many Spaniards wrote "Paso por aquí," or "I pass by here," with their name and date as they scouted and missionized the area north of Mexico. Inscriptions speak to exploration and conquest. During this time, they give the bluff the name it bears today, El Morro, meaning the headland. The Mexican-American War ensues, and even though the territory changed hands, still more inscriptions appear. Now a territory of the United States, the military surveys the area. Lieutenant James H. Simpson and artist Richard Kern are brought to El Morro to see the inscriptions during a survey expedition. Simpson writes in his journal, "The fact then being certain that here were indeed inscriptions of interest, if not of value, one of them dating as far back as 1606, all of them very ancient, and several of them very deeply as well as beautifully engraven. I gave directions for a halt, and Mr. Kern and myself to the work of making facsimiles of the inscriptions." Over the following 2 days, Simpson and Kern create detailed sketches of the inscriptions on the rock. They carve their names, messages that signify both the first Anglo-Americans and the first recorded incidents of exploration out of curiosity rather than for water. America continues westward expansion, and both the military and pioneers write their names on the sandstone bluff. El Morro has seen years of history, and the inscriptions have a tale to tell. What does it mean to want to leave one's mark? Is it impulse? Pride? Boastfulness? A uniquely human desire to record history? If these walls could talk, well, in a way, they can. Today we talk with Ranger Wendy Gordge about the stories behind the inscriptions.
My name is Wendy Gordge. I'm the lead interpretive park ranger at El Morro National Monument, and I'd like to welcome you to El Morro National Monument.
Wendy worked at 10 different national park sites, including El Morro, where she spent 10 years of her career. We first discussed what inspired her to become a park ranger.
Well, I guess like a lot of rangers in the Park Service, I grew up visiting national parks as a kid, and I wanted to find a career where I could be outdoors and tap into my love of nature and also work with people. And so the Park Service was a really good combination of all those things.
This is the first national monument we've had on the show, so we asked Wendy to describe the difference between a national monument and a national park.
Yeah, the biggest difference really between the two is how they come into the system. Generally, national parks are brought in through an act of Congress, but a national monument can be brought into the national park system via presidential proclamation, and that's how El Morro came in 1906 under the Antiquities Act with Teddy Roosevelt.
The drive to El Morro is quite beautiful. Can you describe for the listeners the landscape and beauty that they would see if they came here?
Yeah, sure. So we're located in the northwest corner of New Mexico in a high desert valley. We're at an elevation around 7,200 feet. And as you come through the valley, you can see this tall 200-foot sandstone bluff. It got its name from Spanish explorers that called it this landmark El Morro after the tall sandstone bluffs you can see from either end of the valley here for quite some distance. So it was an important landmark. But seeing the bluff really in a way doesn't belie the entire beauty that you encounter when you walk the trails here. We're surrounded by pinyon, juniper, and a valley that was once upon a time mostly grassland. The bluff is beautiful Zuni sandstone, and at the base of the bluff there's a small pool, which of course is at the heart of our story. It's a small pond there. Mm-hmm. The mesa top is rolling polished sandstone, almost like a lunar landscape of beautiful slick rock, and in places tall trees growing out of the top of it. It's really spectacular.
Let's talk about why this place is famous. You mentioned it's a huge landmark, but to be blunt, it's famous because of graffiti.
Yeah, we have historic graffiti here, over 2,000 historic inscriptions and several hundred Indian petroglyphs. Mm-hmm. So there's a small pool of water here, as I said, that's at the heart of our story. And essentially it was the only reliable water source for 30 to 40 miles back in the day. So anyone traveling in the region, by necessity, they would need to stop here. And in time, they started to leave their names and dates and messages and even little poems scrabbled and carved into the sandstone bluff. So yeah, we have over 2,000 historic inscriptions and several hundred Indian petroglyphs. Yeah. And that spans over 1,000 years of human activity, human history.
And that's just because this was a waypoint.
It was a very
due
important...
primarily to the water, the
exactly.
reliable water source. El Morro has seen quite a bit of history.
Oh, yes. So the first people to use the pool of water here were the indigenous people living in the valley, in the area, and those were ancestral Puebloans. Mm-hmm. They built a village up on top of the Mesa Pueblo about 700 years ago. There's also another remnant of the Pueblo on the north side of the Mesa as well, so it was built in two different stages. But we also see ancient hand and toe holes that come down sheer cliffs to the pool of water. And during its peak, we believe there was about 600 people living on top of the mesa. So that's a really great testament, I think, to the water source here, that it could support that size of population.
You mentioned toe holds, so they were climbing up and down.
Yes, so we know that they came down the cliffs to get water. There was also natural small tanajas or depressions in the rock that they surely would have utilized as well.
Okay. So we can see only a portion of that dwelling up top if you go for a hike nowadays. But there are certainly remnants that have yet to be explored fully or excavated.
So the site is called Atsana, and that's actually a modern Zuni term.
Okay.
And that translates to mean place of writing on the rock. We, of course, don't know what 700 years ago the name might have been for that village site if they had given their home a name.
You mentioned there are some 200 or so petroglyphs, is that correct?
Over 200.
So those were a lot of them are hand shapes. Some are animals. Has there been any meaning derived from that? Can we gain any insights into the Puebloan culture from what we see on the face of the rock?
One of the amazing, beautiful things about El Morro is just the amount of mystery that it embodies. We don't know, we can't say for sure what a petroglyph was meant to say. We can speculate. We don't know if it was an ancient language of sorts or way of communicating, or if it was done for simple pleasure of carving images on the rock. We don't really know for sure what those meanings are.
I think there's always been a human need to leave your mark, regardless of what the meaning might be, maybe just to represent what the Puebloans were seeing around them at the time.
And I think too, it's amazing to see, for example, carvings of bighorn sheep on the wall, or the paw print of a grizzly bear, which of course,
Yeah.
those are now long gone, but it's just a wonderful snapshot of time of what this area was like. So we can very much presume that they were hunting bighorn sheep in the Zuni Mountain and that grizzly bears were roaming through the area.
Now, the Puebloans were only here for a while, relatively speaking. They had moved on to other areas by the time another set of inscriptions start to show
Well,
up.
I would address what you just said in a way because they are still here. They, for the most part, moved down to the Zuni River, became the Zuni people of today. I think oftentimes, perhaps in a Western viewpoint, we look at the village site up at Atsana, and in our own terms for that, we call it abandoned. But I think the descendants of the Puebloans who live here don't see it that way because the spirits of their ancestors still dwell here, and they see it still as part of their greater homeland. So the Puebloans, in a sense, are still very much here in thriving cultures surrounding El Morro.
Do some of the ancestors of the Puebloans that perhaps lived here still come to visit
Oh,
often?
most definitely. It's still considered sacred sites for a number of the Puebloan tribes in the area. There's particularly strong ties, for example, between the Pueblo of Zuni and Atsana. And our work group here who helps to maintain that village site, our Historic Preservation Division, are primarily workers from Zuni.
Okay, so there's this ongoing relationship with the local tribe that may have had ties to this land, still obviously does have ties.
Mm-hmm.
To
And
this
there are
land.
also strong ties with the Pueblos of Laguna and Ackerman and other tribes in the area as well.
So from the Puebloans to those who start to show up and leave inscriptions in Spanish in the 1500s.
Mm-hmm.
So why did the Spaniards come this far north after their conquests in Mexico?
There's a lot of probably great reasons they came north. They were, to some extent, following rumors of the 7 cities of gold, Cibola, that there was an El Dorado, there was a bonanza of gold to be had, and their experiences in South America had given them cause to believe they would possibly find the same thing in North America. So there was also the quest to missionize Native people. There was a goal of colonizing, and there was other ways to gain wealth as well through land and settlement. We actually go back to 1540 with Coronado, who came through this area en route to the Rio Grande area. He did not stop. He didn't inscribe his name. That would have been great. But the entourage that was with him did drop or misplace perhaps various artifacts that we've found today, and that has helped to complete our picture of the earliest Spanish expedition that we know.
Who was the first Spaniard to leave his name here, and who were some of the other notable ones that passed?
So we know that the Espejo expedition came through here in 1598. there is written record. That's really where you start to see the first written records of El Morro.
Mm-hmm.
But the first Spaniard to carve his name here was Juan de Oñate, who was more or less the first governor of this area. We now call New Mexico. Back then it was still New Spain, and it was a very large area that took in, of course, New Mexico and much broader.
But it's a larger area,
Mm-hmm.
certainly larger than what New Mexico is today
Mm-hmm.
as a state. So he was the first governor when Spain had control. There were other Spaniards here that left their mark as well. There were some interesting stories that we ran across. Are there any that stand out in your mind as those who had passed and left their mark?
Oh yeah, there's lots of fascinating stories about the early Spanish explorers and conquistadors. One of my favorite stories at El Morro is that of a Spanish conquistador named Gaspar Perez de Villagra, and he was with the Juan de Oñate expedition in 1598, and he had actually gone down to Mexico on an errand and was racing to catch back up with Oñate, who had gone west of El Morro, when he became separated from his horse. And of course, back then, if you were separated from your horse, no high-speed transportation, and you didn't know where water was, you were really in a lot of trouble.
And just kind of wandering through the desert.
He was wandering through the desert for about 4 days, drifting slowly westward. And he was so concerned about being caught out in the open without a horse or weaponry. He was very concerned that a hunting party might come across his trail, that he tried walking backward for a very long ways. And when that became too tiring, he tried putting his footwear on backward, which only served to blister his feet. And eventually, he said he sat down on a large boulder at the base of a tall cliff, and he couldn't go any further. He was, at that point, too exhausted. But as he sat there, he happened to look down, and he saw a nice, cold, fresh pool of water. And it probably seemed like a vision or a miracle to him, but he described it, and in his account, he said that he stumbled down to the pool, trembling with exhaustion and blind with thirst. And so for Gaspar Perez de Villagra, El Morro spelled survival to him.
So obviously he left his mark. No?
He did not carve his name.
He
in the
didn't
rock.
carve his name at all?
But Oñate
Okay.
did
But we
carve
did
his
hear.
name. He had gone west, and then on his return trip in 1605, Oñate did leave the first Spanish inscription.
Oh, okay. So that was prior to.
So Juan de Oñate carved his name 1605 into the sandstone here at El Morro, and that's 15 years even before the Pilgrims land. So our Spanish history goes way back.
We spoke a little bit about some of the conflicts with the Mexican-American War. We know that New Mexico became a territory of the United States, and it's shortly after that English names start showing up, some accompanied with dates. Can you talk about the first Americans who carved their names in El Morro?
In 1848, with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, this area becomes U.S. soil, and as I guess fate would have it, 1 year later, 1849, gold is discovered in California, which creates huge interest in the ability to move cross-country and get to the gold fields. One of the first Anglos to carve his name into the rock was Richard H. Kern, who was an early artist who stopped at El Morro, and as part of an army expedition, he copied, drew all the inscriptions that he found here, and there were no other English names on the wall at that point in time.
Okay.
So 1849.
And his inscription, if I remember correctly, actually speaks to the fact that he copied what was there.
Right.
So there were a lot of U.S. Army passing through. Who followed after the U.S. Army? Pioneers, gold rush, settlers?
So with all the interest in reaching the gold fields, the Army was looking for ways to create better routes to California. And in 1857, they sent an army expedition, which is the U.S. Camel Corps, led by Lieutenant Beale. And there was two purposes to that expedition. They were looking for a better route to California. They were also testing the usefulness of camels in the desert Southwest. So perhaps one of the strangest animals ever to stop at El Morro was a contingency of dromedaries from the Middle East.
You wouldn't think of camels being here in New Mexico, but...
So a lot of people, for example, assume that they must have not been successful because otherwise, why don't we see camels here? Why don't you see old movies of John Wayne riding a camel instead of a horse? Well, actually, the camels were very successful. In many instances, they outperformed horses and mules. They could go a lot longer without water. They were great walking in very soft sand. They have large feet and foot pads that allow them to do that. With horses and mules, oftentimes you'd have to find grass or you'd have to haul grain along or hay to feed them. But camels were really good at foraging off the land. They would walk up to a sticker bush or a prickly pear or acacia, and they thought that was candy. They would just munch that down. And, so they were very good at fending for themselves. And they have a very long stride. They actually could travel a little faster than horses. So actually they were very successful.
Yeah, it stands to reason that they would be very well suited to this climate. So why ultimately do we not have camels now in this
Well, that's
desert?
a great question. Essentially what happened was the Civil War came along and everybody's attention turned towards that. The Army lost its immediate interest in testing camels. And then following the Civil War, actually the Camel Corps was the brainchild of Jefferson Davis, and that name probably rings a bell with a lot of people. He was the president of the Confederacy, and following the Civil War, Congress and actually no one else wanted anything to do with any of his ideas. So that was one element. And then shortly after the Civil War, the railroad starts to run and make its way west, and that was ultimately the end of the camel experiment.
Because at that point there were more modern technologies.
Exactly.
So speaking about the pioneers that passed through during various times, including the gold rush, some of these pioneers were women, so it wasn't just men leaving their carvings. So we're able to remember.
There aren't a lot of female names, but there's a handful of them. Probably a very small representation of the women that came through here.
So more than likely there were many more than what we have record of here
Yes.
in the rock face.
Right.
But some certainly did do that. Are there a few notable ones that had interesting stories that you recall? I believe there was one that was fairly young who left her name.
There was a young girl named Sally Fox. Her given name was Sarah Fox, but she went by the name Sally. She was 12 years old when she stopped at El Morro. This is on a wagon train, which was known as the Bailey Rose train. They were heading for California. And she was a young girl who carved her name in the rock here. Her inscription has slowly faded over time, and you can just still barely see her inscription.
We noticed it was very faint, although there are still photographs that show it pretty clearly. So it's interesting to be able to preserve that, at least through photograph. Why do you think people in the past here at El Morro felt the need to leave their mark and just to let people know that they passed here?
I think that El Morro was a point in their journey which was a point of pride to have reached this place. It was very difficult to get here. There was lots of dangers for many of the travelers who stopped at El Morro. And I think for a lot of them, it was a point of pride and to say that I was here, as the Spanish did. And I think, for example, the first wagon train that stopped at El Morro and they signed their names into the rock, some of them actually wrote by their names that they were the first immigrant party, the first Western immigrants to stop here. So I think they had a sense of their accomplishment and their achievement. A lot of those, particularly with the Rose Bailey wagon train members, I think they were manifesting hopes and dreams of what lay ahead.
Mm-hmm.
But little did they realize what was waiting for them, because things didn't exactly turn out as they had imagined it would. So they stopped here July 7th, 1858. What they didn't realize was what lay ahead of them. They were heading west into the Mojave Desert and to the hottest point in the year. And as they continued, the days would grow so hot that they couldn't continue. They would just grind to a halt and have to sleep in the shade of the wagons during the day, if that's an easy thing to do, and then continue at night. And as they went further west, the water holes got further and further apart and much more scarce. And then they actually finally reached the boundary between Arizona and California. They were on the eastern banks of the Colorado trying to move the wagon train across the river when they were attacked by a very large group of Mojave Indians, which scattered the livestock that was used to pull the wagons. A number of the party were killed, a number were injured. There were also injuries, of course, on the Mojave side of that equation. But the final analysis was that the party was so traumatized that they ended up turning around and marching 600 miles back to Albuquerque rather than continuing on to California and their destination, which was only about 300 miles.
Wow, okay. Back through the desert.
So they returned by way of El Morro. And the interesting thing is that none of them stopped and inscribed their names on the return trip.
On the way back, they were just too disheartened. That pride at getting here had kind of fled. They were turning tail and returning home at that point.
El Morro was at the edge of the known, and beyond El Morro, there was a small Pueblo village of Zuni, and then beyond that, it really was terra incognito.
Mm-hmm. It's important to preserve what has been left here by the people that have passed through. The graffiti, as I so elegantly referred to it before. So let's talk a little more about the preservation at this location, going from the history into the mission, mm-hmm. And the landscape. Because it's interesting, the very thing that makes it easy to write one's name in the rock, which is the sandstone, it's also allowing nature to begin to wash away a lot of those, as we spoke about.
It's ironic that it was water that drew people here, and
right.
Yet it's water that slowly will dismantle the evidence that they had left.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So what steps has the NPS taken in the past and is currently taking to preserve those inscriptions?
I think that we've come a long way with our scientific approach to preservation. And the first attempts were really, they were oftentimes well-meaning, but we wouldn't take those same measures today. Mm-hmm. For example, one of the early custodians, we would call them superintendents today, but one of the early custodians experimented with various treatments to try and preserve the inscriptions. For example, he would pour gasoline into hot paraffin, mm-hmm. and paint inscriptions with that, hoping that the paraffin would help make the inscription somewhat waterproof so it wouldn't weather. Problem with just painting plain paraffin, melted paraffin onto the rock, was that as soon as it cooled and it would just flake off. And so the gasoline was meant to help permeate the rock grain and carry that deeper into the rock surface. That was not very effective. He tried various treatments and would monitor those over time. Mm-hmm. It was very much hit or miss in a guessing game back then.
Yeah.
Also, one of the early superintendents took No. 2 pencil, graphite, and darkened some of the Spanish inscriptions, mm-hmm. to make them easier to read, easier to see, which is, again, something we wouldn't attempt to do today. I would say that our more modern attempts have been to, first of all, catalog and get a better database of the inscriptions. There's been high definition photography and scanning of the inscriptions to be able to capture that.
So it's preserved even if not on the rock face, it is still preserved in some form.
Right. I think the tricky thing about trying to preserve the inscriptions is that water not only hits the surface of the rock and the inscription, but it also hits the top of the mesa and percolates down through the grains. It doesn't just move down, it also moves to the side. And so, for example, if you try to paint a preservative over an inscription and you actually seal the surface of that inscription, then the water can very well travel laterally and take out an inscription on either side. And with acres of inscriptions, it's you can't really paint the entire cliff face of the Morro.
And you can't hold back nature. Sandstone being very delicate, it's going to.
And we do work with conservators who, when we start to see an inscription that looks like it's going to flake off or begin to spall or chip off a little bit, they come in and can very carefully, using special glues and epoxies, put that back together.
So at what point do we say, let nature take its course with these inscriptions? I imagine now it's more of allowing nature to do its thing.
I think that there is that realization that you can't preserve these forever, though we would love to. And we do our very best. But in time, nature will take its toll on these inscriptions.
Do you have issues with current visitors trying to make their mark?
I would say that the vast majority of our visitors are very respectful to the preservation efforts here. There is a very small percent that do sometimes want to leave their mark or vandalize the rock. We've had those episodes as well.
Right.
It can become incredibly problematic. If you think about it, over the last 1,000 years, we've acquired about 2,000 historic inscriptions, but today we have about 30,000 visitors every year. And so you can imagine if everyone put their name on the rock, what would happen to the historic inscriptions?
Yeah, there's only so much rock there to preserve the history, even as it fades away. And
you know, even though many of the inscriptions are fading, it's still remarkable to me how some inscriptions appear, it seems almost as sharp and clear as you think maybe the day that they were carved. For example, E. Pen Long, who inscribed his name in beautiful cursive. I can't even write that well on paper, let alone imagine carving it into the rock.
Yeah,
and it looks as crisp and clear as it did in 1859 when he left it.
He had an artist's hand, I suppose. So what can we do to help preserve El Morro National?
I think that, again, one thing that we sometimes face is modern graffiti or vandalism, and I think that everyone can help preserve the inscriptions here simply by respecting the historic preservation, and I think through education that builds our appreciation, and through appreciation our preservation.
Now you've been at this park for some time. You even had, as you mentioned earlier, the camels that were here. You've had a camel corps brought here from Texas. I mean, that's going the extra mile for your work.
We had a special event here and in 2014, again in 2016, and we're hoping to repeat that in September of this year, 2018, which is a commemoration of the U.S. Camel Corps that came by El Morro in 1857. And so it's a lot of fun. We have a special historic reenactor and interpreter named Doug Baum. Shout out to Doug. He brings a contingency of 4 camels and sets up an encampment, and we usually have several days of special programming and also kids' activities and school groups, school programming around that.
Yeah, I can imagine it being a hit with the kids and the young at heart as well. Sounds like a lot of fun.
It's great for visitors of all ages. I think one of my favorite memories of working here was the very first Camel Corps commemoration that we did. It was really kind of an unknown, doing the research and even just knowing how this event was going to play out, and the unknown of working with camels. Nothing in my experience had taught me what that would be like.
Yeah, I can imagine.
There was a lot of planning that went into it, and I think the experience of having camels housed in my backyard was something I never foresaw when I went into this profession.
There must be something about it here with your time spent here that speaks to you. So what feelings come up when you think of El Morro National Monument? What makes it special?
Gosh, that's almost like pushing a button for me. I could probably gush for days about how I love this national monument. As I had mentioned to you earlier, this is park number 10 for me and one of my very favorite places to have worked. It has so much fascinating history, wonderful stories here. There's so many great things to talk about, but also just its natural beauty. It's stunningly beautiful. And it's oftentimes surprising to visitors because it's really a hidden gem.
Yeah, there are unique features to be found for enthusiasts of many studies.
Yes, indeed. I think it's rather unusual to find a national monument in a rather small, concise space, and just approximately 1,200 acres, to have so much history in this one crossroads of many different cultures, to have over 1,000 years of history and so many interesting and fascinating stories of the various people that came through here, some well-known and some just what we would think of as everyday folk, but yet with amazing stories.
We talked about what makes El Morro special to you. So what's the importance on a larger picture of the national park system to you, and why is it important to preserve it?
I think the national parks preserve and protect the best our country has to offer. Its scenic beauty, its natural biodiversity. It preserves stories that tell us our history. It tells us who we were, and I think, in a way, who we hope to become.
Even today, El Morro National Monument still has stories to tell. After the interview, we walked with Ranger Wendy along the inscription trail. She said that every time she walks the trail, she sees something different. That even now, this monument has more to teach us every day. One day, 1,000 years of human history will erode, and the inscriptions will be long gone, but not forgotten. The efforts of the National Park System to catalog the inscriptions now will allow us to remember those who made their mark and to tell their stories long into the future. For us, this national monument led to a great deal of introspection. Places like these allow us to learn not just history, but a great deal about ourselves. You may find yourself asking the question, how will you leave your mark on history? If you enjoyed what you heard, review us on iTunes or Android to help us improve the show. And for those who want bonus content, check out our Patreon page via the show notes in the description, or visit podcastswithparkrangers.com. Stay with us through the final minutes here for a short preview of our next episode. We like to highlight on our show ways that a typical park visitor can give back to their national parks. El Morro National Monument is always looking for volunteers. Volunteers staff the desk, walk the trails, and give interpretive talks. Additionally, if you have a specialized skill set and have a project you'd like to help the park with, feel free to give them a call. At El Morro, volunteers have helped with database management, artistic renderings of events, and junior ranger programming. Whether your background is in art, technology, or education, the Park Service can put it to use. Contact the park at 505-783-4226 to inquire about opportunities. Even though we interview park rangers, we are not affiliated with the National Park Service, and any views expressed are not necessarily those of the Park Service. We're just fans of the national parks, just like you. Coming up in episode 4 of Podcasts with Park Rangers, we explore a barren and dramatic volcanic landscape full of lava flows and lava tubes. No, we didn't fly to Hawaii. We drove only an hour east of El Morro to find this place. We continue our journey through New Mexico as we talk geology in the land of fire and ice at El Malpais National Monument.